Welcome everybody to our third Freedom School of the spring semester. Thank you all for coming. I think it's been such a busy semester and especially a busy week with our new Memorandum of Understanding. So I just wanted to start by saying a thank you to all of us really for voting to support our agreement at 91%, and just a short description of the agreement for our wonderful guests who we have today. So where to begin? Rutgers cut 5% of its workforce, and that includes the 30,000 people at Rutgers. So it suffered one of the worst cuts in higher education. And then as a result, a coalition of 19 unions came together to stop the layoffs and to work in solidarity. And we've been engaging in bargaining in response to the fiscal emergency that the university declared last spring, which made it possible for them to evacuate the contract, the faculty and grad student contract, and some of the other contracts with other unions. And for the last 2.5 months or so, we put a pause on the fiscal emergency negotiations because we took the university to court and said, prove you're having a fiscal emergency. We did this because Rutgers, thank you to the Coalition Rutgers unions, had its state funding restored by the state of New Jersey, which was truly exceptional, as well as getting all of the money first from the Federal CARES Act and then from the second stimulus package in the Trump administration. And now, of course, the upcoming Biden stimulus package. So this coalition of unions came together and we were able to negotiate at the top of a list, the most extensive grad extension program of any public university. We were able to get the university to put a moratorium on layoffs until January 1st, 2022. And that date is very important because people will be able to retain their health insurance and their tuition remission through the spring semester. And at the end of the spring semester is when many of the union contracts are up. So this was probably the hardest concession, was stopping the university's right to lay people off and fire them. So there were other concessions that were won, but I think those are the two that we're all especially excited about. So to get us started today, thank you all for coming. Today, we have a very special Freedom School, No More Cages in New Jersey, Rethinking Labor, Mass Incarceration, and Immigrant Detention. My name is Donna Murch. I'm part of the Executive Council of the Union. I'm head of the People of Color Committee. I'm also a historian at Rutgers who's been here for 16 years. I do research in the Black Panther Party. I published a book called Living for the City, and I have a book coming out in a few months called Assata Taught Me, Mass Incarceration, Racial Capitalism, and the Movement for Black Lives. So the discussion we're having today is especially important to me. And I wanted to introduce our amazing speakers that we have tonight. So our first speaker is one of Rutgers' own, the amazing Mark Howard, who is a social justice organizer for our own union, Rutgers AAUP-AFT. He is a graduate of Rutgers from 2019, where he participated in the MountainView project, which we'll be talking about, the MountainView program. And he was also an incredible undergraduate activist who worked on a whole series of campaigns during the Trump administration. So we're very much looking forward to hearing from him. Currently, he works with a number of social justice organizations, including Abolish the Drug War in New Jersey. So I'm really excited to hear about that work. Our next speaker is Sophia Gurulé, who is an attorney, and she works as policy counsel in an immigration practice. She graduated from Cardozo School of Law in 2017, where she was the recipient of the Telford Taylor Award for Outstanding Achievement in the fields of constitutional law and human rights. During law school, Ms. Gurulé also worked in two-year-long clinics, the Catherine O. Greenberg Immigration Justice Clinic and the Criminal Defense Clinic. She also served as the executive editor of the Cardozo Journal of Law and Gender, the secretary of Cardozo's Minority Law Students Alliance, and the community affairs chair at Cardozo. Our final speaker is Tania Mattos. She is the Northeast Policy and Monitoring Manager for Freedom for Immigrants. She focuses on supporting community-based visitation and human rights monitoring programs in detention centers and supports policy advocacy efforts at the federal and state level throughout New York, New Jersey, and the New England region. She joined FFI after 13 years of working as an immigrant and worker rights organizer and to advocate at an international, national, and local level. Prior to working for immigrant rights, she worked on environmental and indigenous people's rights within the United Nations. So I just want to give our panel a hand and thank them all for coming. So I wanted to kind of open our discussion a little bit with a little bit of framing. So, of course, we're all aware of the trial that is going on right now in Minneapolis, as well as the recent killing. It's really worthy almost of its own moment of silence. This year has been, just for many of us, one of the most difficult years, I think, of our lives. At the same time, it has also mobilized incredible resources. And seeing the mass protests that we had in support of the movement for Black Lives last spring and summer, which encompassed between 16 and 26 million people. So in total numbers, these are the largest demonstrations in American history. And yet we're still seeing the difficulty, despite this enormous support for stopping state violence, for stopping killings, for stopping the kind of violent white supremacy that we have seen on January 6th, the past 4 years, and also really a larger continuity of American history. We have reached this watershed moment about this. And yet it is so difficult to translate this into real change. So in keeping with our vision of social justice unionism and intersectional unionism, we wanted to talk about this issue as it relates to Rutgers and as it relates to the state of New Jersey. So I've done a lot of work on mass incarceration, but I don't know nearly as much as I should about how it plays itself out in New Jersey. The other issue that we really wanted to bring this together with was to put immigrant detention and mass incarceration in the same lens. Of course, they are part of the same horror, but sometimes they're talked about in very separate ways. So we really wanted to give pride of place also to immigrant detention, and then to think about how we think about that in the larger frame. So with that, I'd like to open it up with a question. So the way the panel will work is I'll provide a question and then any of the panelists can answer. We have roughly about 40 to 45 minutes where the panel will be presenting, and then after that we can have discussion. So I would suggest to the panelists maybe answer should be between 2 and 3 minutes. So can each of you describe how mass incarceration and immigrant detention are affecting communities in New Jersey? How are they intertwined with one another? Whoever would like to begin.
I can begin for a little bit, and I'll let other folks speak to this. But from my perspective, I'm not an attorney, I'm an organizer, and working with the Abolish ICE New York, New Jersey coalition. I've had the privilege of being in contact with people detained on a daily basis, both in Bergen, Hudson County, basically all of the facilities in New Jersey and New York. And one thing for me that I see very clearly is that once people who serve in custody in jail, they are then transferred to immigration facilities, right? If they are immigrants. So it doesn't matter if you have a green card, depending on what kind of conviction you have or what kind of accusation, because this system that we have, you're arrested, you're just accused of something, and then you go to jail. So they're then sent to immigration detention, where they're being held for their immigration status And so from there, they're either deported or kept there for up to years, many years. The longest I think I've heard of somebody being held in immigration detention is about 10 years, and for their immigration case. So, and something else that I'm noticing, and that's a trend, at least for me now, I'm pretty sure that it's been a trend for a long time, but Black immigrants in these facilities are, when we do campaigns for them, they're not being released as easy as non-Black immigrants. So I think that's something in of itself that we can have a huge conversation about, but that's a trend that I've been seeing as of recent, and I'll let other folks build on that.
Thank you so much for that. I just wanted to ask a quick follow-up question. Are immigrants not subject to 14th Amendment rights of habeas corpus? How are people being held? How is someone being held for 10 years?
Yeah, I can answer that. People do file habeas petitions pretty frequently for people in ICE detention, but they can be pretty complicated, and they are pretty complicated in the District of New Jersey in particular, which is the jurisdiction or the court system that rules in where a lot of the facilities in New Jersey are located. In particular, it's basically like if you want to fight a prolonged detention case, which is the kind of case that you're referring to when you say like 14 years, because that's obviously a prolonged detention case, it can be pretty tough. They need at least like basically a year for people to even be like considered. And then the litigation can go on for a really long time, depending on the different issues. Because sometimes if it's just prolonged detention, depending the custody statute that the person's under, it can get really complicated, which I'm happy to get into more, but I also don't want to totally bore people with like legal stuff. But yeah, it does apply for people in ICE detention.
Thank you. And I wanted to introduce another one of our panelists, who is a colleague of mine, a much loved colleague, who is a professor of history in Rutgers Newark. That is Professor Whit Strub. And it was actually his piece in the New York Times that we included in our invitation, which had a really important reflection about the convergence between machine politics in New Jersey and immigrant detention. So Professor Strub, I was wondering if you could provide us with an overview.
Oh, sure. Yeah, and thanks for organizing this, Donna. It's really an honor to be here, and I'm glad people are attending because this is something I care a lot about. And I think what I would add, I mean, you know, Tania and Sophia have so much more insightful things to say than I do, but as a US historian, I mean, I would just make two kind of quick fundamental points. I mean, one is just that mass incarceration and immigrant detention are historically deeply intertwined through, you know, the sheer existence of the US border, which has never been anything but a violent tool of settler colonialism and imperialism. And those, you know, those histories and that genealogy that leads us to the current system are just absolutely inseparable from one another. The one thing I would add, just, you know, being on the ground in New Jersey, is that also the linkage between mass incarceration and immigrant detention, it's not figurative. It's very literal in New Jersey, where 3 of the 4 immigrant detention centers in our state are all located in county jails in Bergen, Essex, and Hudson County. And for the majority of the Trump years, they became majority immigrant detention centers. It was one of the bitter ironies of bail reform in New Jersey, which passed right as Trump took office, that a measure intended, a sort of liberal reformist measure intended to at least mitigate some of the ravages of the carceral state by emptying beds out of jails, just led to new bodies being put in those beds through county contracts with ICE, in which these all Democratic counties basically take federal money from ICE in order to hold people in jail cells for them. And that's something that, you know, on the abolitionist left and in the immigrant justice movement, we've been very engaged in the last 4 years. You know, I have pictures, but I don't want to talk too long in one sitting. I can come back if people want illustrations. I've got a little set of images, but they can wait. I mean, that would be just the really brief overview I would offer. So thank you.
Thank you so much for that. Mark, do you have thoughts? And can you also help us map what mass incarceration looks like in New Jersey?
Yeah, sure. I mean, first I want to start by saying thank you for putting this together, Don. This is extremely important. And mapping out kind of mass incarceration in New Jersey is kind of easy because New Jersey stands alone as the worst state of mass incarceration in terms of having longer, harsher sentences, with more than half the population that is incarcerated being for violent crimes, and then the other smaller half coming in, rotating multiple times due to like petty things as traffic violations, et cetera, et cetera. So New Jersey has like a picture to be painted, right? New Jersey is the spot where if anything can get done, it needs to be done here because we've had such a wild, oppressive history with incarceration in New Jersey, as well as having the oldest prison in New Jersey, Trenton State. That's the first prison. And they have held up their end of maintaining itself as a cage for folks for quite some time. Recently, in the past few years, at least in the work that I've been able to do with some of the left and the abolition movement, is kind of dismantle some of the oppressive systems and tactics that they were using within facilities of people who are currently incarcerated, such as solitary confinement, not taking away the individuals' rights to vote, which are tied to a lot of other aspects of benefits and support and whatnot that they can receive upon being released. So New Jersey, so right now I think that a lot of our movements are starting to combine because we realize that we have to kind of work together to kind of figure out what is the force that's established in it itself, right? If it's a detention centers, it's their right seat. Whit and a couple other panelists have pointed something out very important, which are that because New Jersey is able to take facilities and put them literally in other facilities, they're kind of able to dance around language a lot, which allows them to be a lot harder to defeat and kind of like separate and dismantle and disrupt. Because if you address one thing that's within another facility, you by proxy, you just have to address the entire thing. Like it's like a bunch of little small Russian dolls put inside of each other. You know what I mean? Like they're all very similar, all in the same space. And if you address one flaw of one thing, you're going to obviously hit the with others. So I think that it's an interesting relationship we have in New Jersey with that, and a lot of other ways that we can speak about that. And I'll defer to the other panelists and you to kind of move things forward.
Thank you so much for that. Sophia, did you want to speak to New York or kind of New Jersey and the metro area and your work?
Yeah, for sure. It's interesting when you ask the question about it in terms of New Jersey as well, because a lot of the people that are held within the ICE facilities in New Jersey, not exclusively, but a lot of the people who are there are actually from New York. Were living in New York prior to their ICE arrest. Sometimes people are actually from New York, but have an arrest in New Jersey, and then that also brings them to a certain facility within New Jersey itself. Like was mentioned, I am a public defender. I'm also in a union. Our contract is not finalized, which is like why we're talking about it that way. But yeah, I've been representing people in those facilities, particularly at Hudson County, Essex County Correctional Facility, and Bergen County Jail for about 3.5 years at this point. And those facilities, even though they're local jails, and people tend to think that people tend to have different feelings about local jails, particularly when we talk about ICE custody, because oftentimes it's painted as that it's just a private prison industry or a privatization problem. In reality, it's just actually a problem of incarceration and the fact that, actually city governments are constantly getting money off of these different contracts that they have with ICE. And what I think has been so powerful in particular around the Abolish ICE New York, New Jersey coalition is highlighting that and really revealing and pulling off the masks of, the different freeholders and commissioners that are pretty blatant about it, that they're like, no, we need these contracts for purposes of funding sometimes ourselves. I mean, I've seen reporting about the fact that some of the Bergen County commissioners have their own kind of relationships to money related to the Bergen County Jail. and then also seeing it within the different freeholder meetings. I mean, they're pretty blatant about it. And I remember in 2018, New Jersey residents going in and also talking about it in that context of wanting to keep their taxes lower with the ICE contract. So it's a problem that is, I think, very specific to the tri-state area. It's not exclusive to the tri-state area, but I really value the organizing work that has gone in around that to make this connection, because people tend to think it's not as prevalent or it's not as bad, but there's so much lack of transparency that comes with local jails and ICE contracting, because ICE doesn't actually have to be accountable to what goes on within those facilities, that it's just like a hole that no one can get information from in a lot of different ways. But I'll stop there for now.
Thank you so much for that. One of the things that I find continually frustrating, more than frustrating, is, as someone who teaches about mass incarceration, is that so many students, and whenever we give talks publicly, we're always asked about private prisons. And it's always this focus on private prisons driving the incarceration boom in the United States. And my response is always that when it comes to domestic criminalization, the so-called criminal justice system, only 10% of incarceration is privatized. And then I talk about immigrant detention, which overwhelmingly are private entities that are so poorly regulated. And so that is a constant source of frustration. And I was wondering just how you guys understand that and think about that, because I don't know how else to explain why this doesn't enter public discourse in the way that we need it to. Why can't we mobilize the same anger about private for-profit corporations being used in immigrant detention as it being the kind of default analysis that many people have of our mass incarceration system? Any thoughts about that?
I can start. I think people, well, one, I learned it from Ruth Wilson Gilmore beyond just my own experiences in working with people within the local jails. Like, she is someone who really helped me understand that in a deeper way. So I just want to name that. It's not like I woke up understanding these things, but I also think people have a harder time recognizing that our local, like I said, like our local governments, our local elected officials are people that are making these choices all the time. People also don't want to accept that jails don't need to exist for any reason, whether it's for people being held for criminal charges, which is, that's the difference between like a jail, is that people are going through the criminalization process within the criminal legal system and are oftentimes being held there because of charges that have not yet been proven against them, because the state actually has the burden to do that. But for some reason, we still think that pretrial detention is a thing that we need to keep us safe, even though we know that, I live in New York City, so I'm going to make it a little New York centric for me. I'm sorry. But, we know Rikers Island is a very violent place. We know the levels of violence that happen within there. We know that people die there. We know these things, and yet we're still obsessed with this idea that Rikers Island needs to stay open. And it's not even a possibility to try to end pretrial detention, even though there's tons of people who are living their lives with criminal charges on the outside from all different parts of society. So it's like, why do we need to incarcerate people as they fight their cases? So for me, I think it's one, people not reckoning with the fact that we're all actually benefiting in one way or another, where our localities are benefiting from it, including us as residents of these different cities and states, but also people still thinking that pretrial detention is a thing that we need, when we really don't. It's not just about bail reform, it's about just ending pretrial detention entirely. But we'll get there. We're not there yet, but these conversations help.
Thank you for that. Tania, did you have ideas?
Yeah. So first of all, I think it's important to have the facts of, well, in New York State, private prisons are not allowed as of 2017, I believe, 16. So we don't have private facilities in New York. And now there's a trend across the country to, including President Biden, to talk about private prisons and, having them end the contracts, et cetera. In New Jersey, we do have private prisons, private immigration facilities and public immigration facilities. Now, like Sophia said, all of us here benefit from these facilities somehow. And so the politicians, and I'll be honest, I've never seen politics the way that is run in New Jersey in my life. I've never seen anything like it. It is insane. And I bet you all know about it or have heard about it. But if you have not, and that's something for us to highlight, is just the blatant violations that happen in these New Jersey County commissioner meetings. But also, Sheriff Curtin, the sheriff of Bergen, he was the NAACP president at one time. And the NAACP president, the NAACP currently still stands behind him. And then the unions are unions that represent correctional officers as well. They're backing. They're okay with these correctional officers violating people there every single day, sexually abusing people. They're on a regular basis. Essex, to me, one of the worst facilities is Essex County. Essex County, the guards are ruthless, just ruthless. Right now I'm working on 4 civil rights complaints based off sexual assault from Essex County. So these things, and I think that's why the coalition, the Abolish ICE coalition, is great at putting these stories out there and letting people know. We have to get the word even further out. That's why we're here. Sophia is like overwhelmed, has so many cases. She can only do so much, and appreciate all her advocacy. But it's our job, my job, all of us, to bring these stories to you, to talk about what's happening inside, and hopefully, the residents of New Jersey, it also takes like on the ground organizing as well to push them forward. But also calling out these unions, like, why are you supporting these correctional officers who are violating people every single day?
Who are some of the unions that are supporting it? Is it just the correctional officers unions, or is it broader New Jersey unions?
I think can someone else answer that? I'm not too familiar with specific unions. Jersey.
If you want, I could jump on.
That'd be great, Whit.
I mean, Mark, if you want to, go ahead. Yeah, no, okay. I mean, I'll say this quick. Let me give an example. 3 really quick things with the distinction, Donna, that you're making about the public and private nature of the carceral state. I think, the first level is the ways in which these public facilities in New Jersey drive the detention and deportation apparatus in a way that I think people who aren't super engaged don't necessarily understand until you really, get involved in this, because it is such a complicated system that hides itself so well. And so, in addition to being a proud member of the Rutgers AAUP-AFT, of course, that's important to mention here, but, I've been pretty active with North Jersey DSA, the Democratic Socialists of America. And in DSA, especially during the Trump years, what we'd see is that when people first get active on these issues in North Jersey, they're like, I'm here because I hate Donald Trump. He's a racist. Stephen Miller, he's a racist. And obviously they are. These are disgusting, evil human beings who, someday should be tried for crimes against humanity. But, at the ground level in New Jersey, that's not what's driving this system. What's driving it are these Democratic county machines that take tons of money from ICE, do all the work for ICE, and then cover for ICE. And so, like Tania said, I mean, these freeholders, they're 100% Democrats in Hudson County, Bergen County, and Essex County. There's not a single Republican in any of these positions of authority, but they cover up for the atrocities that are committed in their facilities because they're making tens of millions of dollars from this. And they have a deep financial commitment. Politically and rhetorically, they like to position themselves as, against Trump and racism. And now they're in a bit of a complicated bind with Biden because it's a little harder to distance themselves. They want to ally themselves with the exact same policies, essentially. But at the ground level, I mean, they are doing the dirty work of ICE. And so it's always a matter of sort of political education, at least in the kind of radical context when people get involved. We're not necessarily, we are talking about federal policy, but we're specifically talking about the local implementation of it in New Jersey. And then on the private side too, I mean, the one private facility in New Jersey hides itself very effectively politically as well, the Elizabeth Detention Center, which is run by Core Civic, which of course is also a prison profiteer company. But the building that it's in is owned by this leasing firm in Elizabeth, the Elberon Development Group. And you can see the sort of layers of complicity with which this system perpetuates itself. So the Prudential in downtown Newark is one of the largest investors in private prison companies, including Core Civic and Geo Group. And then the owners of, literally the owners of this ICE jail in Elizabeth are on the board of places like Kane University, which has the second highest number of undocumented students in New Jersey, and NJPAC, the New Jersey Performing Arts Center in downtown Newark, which loves to talk about how social justice-y and progressive it is. You know, again, literally the owner of an ICE jail is on its board. We've held protests in person outside. We've called them relentlessly. And it is almost impossible to break these webs of power. They really protect one another. But as a really good example, just go back to the union question. This is the last thing I'll say, and then I'll shut up. A great example of that, I'll put it in the chat here. Wayne Richardson, who recently became the president of the Essex County Commissioners, he had been vice president. And in fact, the only member of the entire Essex County government that had been somewhat with us against the ICE contract, Brendan Gill, was the old president, and he got voted out this year to be replaced by a guy who does the work of the machine. And if you look at his bio there, it's a perfect example of a guy who got into county level politics, like it says, working with Laborers Local 101, the Laborers Eastern Region Organizing Fund. You know, this does go to the question of labor complicity. And I could give some other examples too. I can drop one in the chat. Tom Sullivan in Bergen County is a leader in the electrical engineering union up there, the IBEW. And so, I mean, these firms, you know, it's a really unfortunate reflection on some of the politics of some unions that, you know, they do maintain a silence around these issues that affect the working class, like mass incarceration and immigrant detention, because they are politically embedded in the, you know, county level democratic machines. And, you know, in Bergen County, like Sophia alluded to, I mean, there's a financial incentive. You know, the IBEW is the group that gets the contracts in the jail, while their own member sits on the board that allows the ICE contract to continue. And so there's there's a lot of layers of complicity here, and it's an uphill struggle to sort of even make them visible and legible to people, and then to go beyond that and challenge them. So yeah, I can stop there though.
Thank you so much for that. It's so important. You know, I think one of the important findings in history is that, especially for those that also of us that lived through the 1970s and 1980s, we often thought of mass incarceration as being driven by the Republican Party. So it was a narrative of first talking about Richard Nixon's war on drugs, and then Ronald Reagan's war on drugs, and then George Bush's continuation from Ronald Reagan. But one of the things that history has shown us is that mass incarceration was incubated in the two-party system. The earliest mandatory minimums were passed by Democrats in the 1950s. It's, of course, Lyndon Johnson who launches the war on crime in 1965, at the same time that he launches the Great Society and the war on poverty. So I think that that is one of the most intractable problems in the two-party system that we have. One, this incredible incentive structure. Some of it is a state economy. So this is one of the few ways in a time of retrenchment that municipalities and counties can get money from the federal government. So the carceral state becomes really important in that. But then also these other questions about where private interests insert themselves. Mark, did you have thoughts about these questions about kind of the prison economy on the one hand, and also how do we understand this as union members, as people in labor?
Yeah, so I've always, it's always been an interesting kind of thing. I think Whit kind of illustrated it perfectly about, like, you know, how you kind of need to take the framework of it before going into like a deep analysis of like why this is or how all these relationships are intertwined. The police unions have been unionized longer, right, than folks who have been in working class positions that have been typically shunned and not let into unions. So I think the new in the way that we should restore that relationship and what unions' role is to the working class and to folks who've been impacted is to start to make a direct space for them. That is something that New Jersey hasn't taken a part of yet, but it's something that we've seen definitely needs to be addressed due to the bail reform, which anyone who understands that knows that was, you know what I mean, or removing your background checkbox, removing the checkbox, that was pushed back on and became nothing more than a bunch of theatrics. So I think that it's important that we should reevaluate that situation, because a lot of folks who are starting to come out of these situations, or who end up being in these situations in the first place, is because they don't have proper employment. And this even applies to folks who may have compromised or certain documentation issues, right? If they were at a job that would protect them and kept them wherever they needed to be at, and they would have the resources and can do what they needed to do, they would be least likely to be in situations where they had to be in contact with authority figures that would put them into a detention center. Right. And folks who are already in working class situations, who can have gainful employment after being impacted, they can now have a stable part and shareholder and stake in their community, in their employment, where they can start to kind of get more involved, et cetera, and use the skills that they so-called are supposed to be giving when they're away. So I think it kind of raises more interesting questions than it has illustrated before. You know what I mean? Right now, I think that a lot of unions that have relationships with police officers and police unions are starting to kind of reevaluate them, or at least build distance. And so that's good. And I think that that's an area and a time, and now's the time, of course, and a time to start to build and think about what that could look like for folks who were formerly impacted by incarceration.
Thank you so much for that really powerful, not just analysis about labor in the organized institutional sense, but labor in the human sense, which is, giving us a working class and class analysis about this. One thing I'm struck by is the problem of basically generation politics. So among baby boomers and Generation X, I think most of all among baby boomers, including some of the people that come out of the radical movements, they have a very different conception about prison abolition. And in some ways, I've seen it in the labor movement itself. People that are by far on the left wing of the labor movement, who are part of the organized left, who have fought for kind of grassroots unionism, supported strikes, supported militant radical organizing. But I do think there is a genuine intergenerational dialogue that needs to be had. For my part, one of the things I think about labor, even thinking about unions' own self-interest, with this enormous Black Lives Matter protest and this real shift in the center of the country about saying cages are wrong, we need to stop cages and we need to stop killings by the state. This has been a profound shift. The problem is that, for people that oppose unions now, one of the most common arguments that I hear is they use police unions as the representative union. And I try to argue with them and say, well, actually, the most unionized people in the United States are African Americans. Why? Because they work in the public sector. What is that public sector? Education first. It's care work. A lot of historically women's professions, civil service, municipal employment. So I think that we need to think about really how to kick out the police unions and have a campaign, because I think it's time for kind of successive generations of political people to make this argument and fight these fights. And I've become absolutely convinced we need to do it in order to stop mass incarceration, but we also need it to protect the labor movement, which is losing its legitimacy because now police unions are getting to represent the public sector. Okay, so this is the perfect transition. All of you in various ways have talked about your alternate frameworks. One of the frustrating things is that the kind of lionization of the police and the military, in many ways, they're celebrated in the same ways. I happened to tune in to the funeral of the Capitol officer who was killed. And of course, President Biden was speaking. But there is a kind of celebration and lionization. And whenever the police are mentioned in mainstream media, they are mentioned in hallowed ways as if they have made the greatest sacrifices. But we actually know that being a policeman is not the most dangerous job. And levels of danger, it's actually somewhere in the middle. One of the most dangerous jobs in the United States is largely held by undocumented populations, which is meat processing. right? Very dangerous places. So I'm wondering if you can talk to us about your own activism and what kinds of alternate frameworks that we can bring to understand this issue and to kind of undo the internalization of punishment as the solution to everything and law and order as a default. Tania, would you like to start us off?
Sure. So speaking about just like my activism around what isn't a, like, I don't know if it's saying like the word alternative, but a decarceration plan would be much better framed. I see more of a framework to work around safety, right? And people in detention right now, they're doing hunger strikes, they're being abused, they're not safe. These places of prison, these places of detention centers, they're not safety. And so I think that in the immigration field, what me and my colleagues are working on is creating that framework of having a more community-based way of helping people through their immigration process. So it's not punishing them for being immigrants, it's helping them and supporting them. And so right now, ICE is creating their alternatives to detention right now with ankle bracelets, ankle monitoring, facial recognition phones. So that's the future of what detention is going to look like. We have a very, very small window, I think, and a very good opportunity right now to create those alternatives, but we can't do that if we don't work together between the immigrant and criminal justice movement, in my opinion. And so in relation to labor, you're very right when you say that, where we're going to lose people. My family comes from labor as well. My family, fortunately, they're 32BJ, SEIU 32BJ. Most of the people in my family are unionized. But yes, there is a generational mishap or not understanding. And it's because these unions, AFL-CIO, back up the police unions as well. So from what I'm getting from young people is that unions are say one thing and speak another thing. Same thing with gentrification. I have the same argument with SEIU, is that on one hand they post posters up talking about gentrification. On the other hand, they work with developers for union jobs. So to go back to this framework, so we're trying really hard to find the funds in order to have organizations in New Jersey, in New York, and across the country to be able to fulfill this vision that we have of having it be community-based and more of a holistic way of supporting immigrants.
Thank you so much.
Mm-hmm.
Sophia, would you like to go next?
Sure. I'm just thinking about a lot of things, but it's interesting, like hearing the generational divide part, because I think that's really true, but it's also weird for me because I feel like I learned about abolition from so many elders, from so many people who have been fighting for this for decades since the 70s. So it's like hard for me to understand that, because I'm like, oh, the people who brought me to abolition or like introduced me to abolition were like, of course, Angela Davis, Miriam Kaba. I hope she doesn't get mad that I referred her as an elder, but like so many people have been doing so much work around it. But at the same time, it's very true. And like thinking about Mark's comments earlier about like the carceral state and thinking about how it creates jobs and opportunities for people, that does bring in people of color and Black people and Latinx people to be the state enforcers, to be the correctional officers, or to be the police officers or the border patrol officers. Like that is also very real, like even within my own family, of knowing law enforcement, having law enforcement in my family, and also having people who have been for union members, basically my whole life at least. So it's when I think about just even that and thinking about when I've been to different private detention facilities in the South and being like, wow, the only two employers in this entire small town are the jail and the ICE detention facility, like that to me is the carceral state. Like we actually need to be we need to abolish it. Like we need to abolish jails and prisons and detention facilities. But part of that is also investing in communities, investing in community, exactly what Tania was talking about, like alternatives to, you know, what we consider punishment. Like we can create community safety networks and mutual aid and so many different things where we actually rely on one another and redefine the way that we view ourselves and one another. I mean, I feel like capitalism basically makes us like into individuals where we're just like existing by ourselves, or that's rather what it would want, especially in the United States. But like when we redefine our relationships and our commitments to one another, that is how, in my mind, like how we can abolish these different regimes. It's not just decarcerating these facilities, which is obviously a huge part of it. It's also investing in our own communities and in our own families and in our own relationships. And it's a lot of work. I mean, I am a prison industrial complex abolitionist, border abolitionist. Like I very much like am constantly learning and growing, not only just from reading books, but like from actually my relationships with one another in terms of organizing work, in terms of being a union member and thinking about my own role within that union, and like knowing that unions aren't always good, you know, like unions can do really harmful things. And it's like, how do we actually do union work in support of ending the carceral state? So, I mean, the unions that do, the lawyers and social workers and legal advocates that do a lot of work within the facilities did come out with statements against ending the Hudson County jail contract because, and that was different from our management, and I'll leave it at that. But it did happen because we were committed to that. And we are starting to think of ourselves as unions who are committed to abolition. What does that mean when you're actually like a lawyer or a social worker? Again, because these are not roles that are inherently good. Like, what does it actually mean collectively to commit ourselves to abolition and to make abolition not just an idea or a title that people like to stamp on themselves now, like actually like a way of life and relating to one another?
Yeah, thank you for that. I mean, I think one thing I appreciate so much about what you both said is that in order to talk about prison abolition, we have to think about ourselves, our families, our larger social world, and then our institutions. I was listening to Miriam Kaba talk about this because it's also tapping into questions of punishment that we internalize throughout many different parts of our life. So I think that that's why it's powerful. It also is something that can be channeled in multiple ways. But thank you for doing that work, because I think these are conversations that need to be had in our unions. They need to be had in our families. They need to be had in our churches, like that slow work. I'm working on my own family, which is why I was thinking in generational terms, as well as also just seeing the discussions that the AFL-CIO has had about this and going to those forums and being really shocked to see heroes of mine who have fought real battles in the labor movement. Also, this framework is foreign to them. And I think there's a deep, effective, vision of the world that, that we need to work on shifting. So Mark and Whit, I'd love to hear what you guys have to say about this. And if you might also give us a little bit of an overview, because I think some people on the call may know what prison abolition is, others may not. This may be a new framework for people. Can you kind of give us some definitions and overview of what it means to be a prison abolitionist? Mark, would you like to start?
I can start. So yeah, as an overview for prison abolition, right, is to one, I think of it in like actually a tangible step plan, right? I mean, it has various different ways it can be envisioned and perceived, but I believe in being very effective and precise and starting there. You know what I mean? Starting with some steps. Part of my steps is thinking about what it means when your vision and your political goals are focused on decarcerating folks, right? Dismantling the system and restoring and reimagining, right? So abolishing prisons is about truly addressing the root of an oppressive system and how it determines it wants to be state-sanctioned violence against its civilians, that it determines are not valued as much as the other ones based on white supremacy. So I won't go into that, but basically I think that if we start by always constantly reimagining that has to be dismantled and addressed completely, and that we can possibly restore and reimagine a different way to go about problem solving issues. Like, I think prison abolitionism is really truly based on understanding that we deserve the equal right to live and to be in a decision and control to problem solve about our society and what we think are issues in our society and how we think we should handle them. As an overview, I think I can start there, and then more to be more specific in terms of the work I do and what I hope to start to kind of see has an impact in New Jersey, and abolishing the drug war and abolishing, you know what I mean, these very, very specific aspects that are hurting and impacting the communities, and reimagining that aspect and letting it be the precedent to kind of trickle and continue to infect the rest of the system in certain ways, not in a neoliberal way where we need to vote on policies that can change based on a political season, but actually take away the state's right to do a certain thing or to oppress a certain way. And so in one of the ways that can look like like we've seen recently in across the country in the state is abolishing certain facilities, the ability to incarcerate certain folks over a certain age, under a certain age, for certain crimes, no longer being able to be incarcerated for. Like, these are important steps, I think, that starts to illustrate how the abolition work is and is becoming. And then the way that it looks like is when those same steps are taken to dismantle and incarcerate folks and dismantle that system, when they are replaced and restored with a way that is effective, where the community is involved in how people are working together and what decisions are made, and how the community and the people involved in any event of a social issue or harm is addressed and restored and reimagined without the state's involvement of white supremacy and colonial oppression that they use with facilities and police brutality.
Thank you so much for that, Whit.
Yeah, no, that's a tough act to follow, Mark. I mean, I agree with everything you said. I don't think I could add anything smarter to it. I would just add in terms of something like abolishing ICE. For a lot of us who are on the socialist left or the immigrant justice community, a world with no borders is the sort of utopian ideal to aspire to, right? I mean, borders are literal violence in the United States and elsewhere. The EU is guilty of this. Australia is guilty of this. I mean, borders are violence. But none of us think we're going to get there in one fell swoop, right? It's not, there's no simple path to power. And so I do think, being an historian, I mean, it's useful just to remind people, that like abolish ICE is not a utopian slogan, right? I mean, many of us on this call are old enough to remember a world without ICE. And I mean, none of us are calling for a return to, some glory days of the INS. That's not at all the goal here, right? But the reality is ICE, as we know it, is a political invention of the 21st century that was created when the Department of Homeland Security was created in a moment of sort of Islamophobic national nativist backlash under George W. Bush. And then so I think having just using history to give a glimpse of a tangible different world is a powerful tool. And I think a lot of the local activism against ICE, is part of that. We can't destroy ICE here in New Jersey on our own, but we can dig out this local complicity, root and branch, and show how it can be done, how communities can dismantle this system, not from the top down, because our politicians, Republican and Democrat, are not going to do this without enormous pressure, but from the bottom up. We can refuse to collaborate, and we can, intervene in the machinery of this apparatus as best we can. And, I think it's morally incumbent upon all of us to do that, to do everything we can, to show a glimpse of that world that, refuses complicity in these systems as the first step. So yeah, that's what I would add. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. So we have about a half an hour left, so I'm going to open it up for questions, and we already have someone in stack, so I'll be calling on her in a minute. I just wanted to underline that point that Whit made about the history of ICE. I have my own very tangible memory of ICE when I grew up in Western Pennsylvania, and sometimes I would take the train from New York City once I was working at Rutgers in the early 2000s back to Buffalo and then to Erie. And I remember I was going back to New York City, and in Buffalo, they really looked like soldiers. They came on with their ICE flak jackets and with their weapons drawn, and they were running through the train after someone. And there was just this sense of everyone in the train. I'd never seen that happen. And I think that's happening all the time in all different parts of life. But, it was happening in an interior part of the country, and just the scale of violence, it was very frightening. I think trains figure in our imagination in ways maybe different even than buses, because just seeing this like military force move through the train, and of course people are captive. So that's my own very tangible memory, post 9/11. And I think probably all of us have those multiple experiences, but that's the one that stood out to me. That I've never forgotten. Okay, so I'm going to open it up for comments and questions. Our first person is Ellen Littlefield.
Hi, Professor Strub was just speaking about working from the bottom up as far as the community. I'm concerned that we're not educating our children sufficiently in the K-12 about these issues, that by the time they're college age or out and working, they just haven't had enough of the correct information about history, what they really should know about it. And I just wonder, relative to the teachers' unions, what can somebody in the community do? I mean, I know you can be involved in asking of your board of ed, but isn't the teachers' union in this country for K-12, isn't that a very large union? And how do they interact with this concept of bringing this information to children? If anyone could address that, I appreciate it.
Thank you so much for that, Ellen. Thoughts? Anyone know the position of AFT on mass incarceration?
I was going to say, I don't know anything about the teachers union like that, but I can just speak to the bottom up approach that Whit was talking about, which is that I talk to my little cousins about this. I talk to my younger family members, and we have pretty grown conversations about these different things. And, there are people whose father was deported. And so they understand things on a personal level, but also working with them to talk about it, not only just in terms of their personal experiences and emotional responses to this type of violence, but also to share this type of paradigm and to get their feedback and ask, what does it mean to imagine a world without prisons for you? What does it mean to imagine no ICE, because they're even younger? And so to that, ICE is part of their life and something that they know in many different ways. And for me, I'm always inspired by what children and younger people have to say. I have a lot to learn from younger people. They are understanding concepts way faster than I did when I was their age. But I think it's really about finding, again, within your own community or within your own family, finding time to talk about these things, and also to pose these questions to them, because kids can have such an imagination that adults just don't. They can't do it. So I think there's a lot of hope in children and younger people. I don't know, I'm talking
other thoughts?
Yeah.
I just wanted to ask if anyone, I'm sorry.
Just quickly, I wanted to mention that AFT, they do invest pensions in prison stock. So and we wouldn't have known that. We would not have known that if it wasn't for the workers investigating. I know I used to work at as an education and outreach director, and I worked with a lot of teachers And I think that I've seen that New York City public school teachers care the most, but they also, some of them are also extremely racist at the same time. But the teachers that I've seen care the most will fight tooth and nail for their children. And they do bring up these ideas of detention, and they have to deal with their children every day. You know, their parent was detained, and the child doesn't want to do any work, etc. So they're very much at the forefront, and I'm pretty sure that they are the ones that brought up this idea of divesting from private and public facilities via their pension. So I would encourage, other folks to do the same thing.
Thank you so much for that. We're going to move on to the next question. I just wanted to say quickly that, the Chicago Teachers Union, and at Rutgers, we look to them in all things. And I talked to Stacey Davis Gates this week, and it was really profound to hear about the way that they understand the fight for the reinvestment in public goods, because that is always the second piece of prison abolition. It's taking away monies from the punishing violent parts of the state and then arguing that those monies need to be used in reinvestment in communities. And they've literally won, subsidies, support for homeless students who can't shelter in place, nurses and counselors in every school, ways to get resources redirected into public goods, because that's always the second half of the equation. But I think the fight within, again, just like our talk about the AFL-CIO, the fight within the NEA it's NEA, right? I didn't realize actually that the NEA is almost double the size of the AFT. This is why we have freedom schools, so we can all get educated. Those fights continue. We have another question from Eric Maroney.
Hi, good evening. I don't know if I have quite a question, but I just sort of wanted to weigh in on what the last speaker had said. First, thank you for having this. I'm from Connecticut, and so we're sort of joining and trying to learn from all the work that you all are doing. I'm a former high school student now, community college faculty member. I have some other colleagues on the call with me, but I just wanted to follow up with the point about curriculum, right? Curriculum, like anything else, is not neutral, right? It's always in tension. It's something that can be contested. And AFT, I'm a member of AFT, was as a high school teacher, am now as a community college faculty member. They have great positions, right, on curriculum, but what does that look like on a local level if we're not constantly sort of pushing that forward and leaning on local leadership to engage membership and to make curriculum a political issue? It's not going to happen. And I think part of that has to do with the structure of AFT, right? The fact that people were talking about cops out of unions. Well, if you have an education union, right, talking about service, social reproductive work, service work, education, nursing, and then corrections officers, right? So there's a bit of a disconnect there. So I just wanted to, I apologize that wasn't a question, but I did just want to share some of those thoughts. And again, thank you for letting us, folks from Connecticut, listen in.
Oh, of course. Everyone is welcome at Freedom School. Thoughts from our panelists? He said it pretty well, didn't he? Okay, we have a question that came up in the chat from one of our own union members. I was wondering if any of the panelists had thoughts about what abolition can teach us about solidarity in the labor movement and vice versa. Like from a labor standpoint, could something like solidarity between incarcerated people and people in corrections be imaginable?
I'm gonna fill the silence. Like I'm just that type of person. I'm not incarcerated, so I can't really speak to whether there can be solidarity between incarcerated people and people in corrections. I do know that there's a lot of amazing abolition work being done by incarcerated people, both in ICE detention facilities and federal prisons, who do a lot of amazing writing that informs the rest of us on the outside. So I would look to them to kind of talk about that specific point. But in terms of solidarity, like more broadly in the labor movement, I think one thing that I always think about that Miriam Kaba said, which is that basically like being an abolitionist isn't just like a title, and it's not just you have to be doing one kind of job. It's a theoretical framework. It's a praxis, and so it's whatever space that you're in, whatever union that you're in, you apply it within that space, and you fight for the things that you know will make a world without prisons possible. So, like was being said, like investing in schools, that means actually divesting from police and prisons. Like that, you can fight for those different things and look to other unions to see how they do that. And, you know, at least I'll speak for the union that I'm in. Yeah, like we made that choice around the Hudson County contract. It was different from management. And we know that theoretically that can mean if there's no one in detention within these facilities, we wouldn't have a job representing people in these detention facilities. And we made that choice to be in solidarity with people inside and to be willing to abolish our own jobs. And that really is a goal. So the way that for myself, I think about it is like you're operating within your own box and your own framework, and you're applying an abolitionist praxis and connecting with people wherever you see it connecting.
Thank you for that. Thank you. Other people on the panel? Whit or Mark, ideas about this?
Yeah, I echo what Sophia said. I think that was pretty accurate. You know, in terms of the broader labor movement and solidarity movement, it's about operating in the space and what it means to make space for people who are impacted directly, right? Or who are formally impacted. If it's a labor movement, then it's about labor, right? What ways do people who are impacted by incarceration may have an issue or may seek to benefit from the labor movement? Immensely, I would say, like having, stable employment and working that into start to be like a language or an idea or a goal. And that can start from including people who are impacted into like discussions and conversations and, with union members and or with union leaders or et cetera. So I think there are like a couple of different ways it could start and to what it could lead to, as well as I think, and then in terms of like solidarity between, like people who are in corrections, like officers and people who are impacted. I mean, I'm sure there are magazine articles of stories that stand out there, but I would say absolutely, I don't know about that one.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
Can you explain, because other people also can talk about this, why is it so hard to imagine solidarity with police and corrections officers? It's an obvious question, but I think we actually have to say it because this is not an uncommon question. So maybe we can speak to why is that so difficult?
Yeah, the pain and trauma is just too deep. It runs too deep in terms of the inherent role of an officer. And for people who are impacted and someone who's been impacted by the criminal justice system, I do not see how that could ever be healed. Like no one who's been oppressed directly by that boot will ever be able to unsee the boot. You know what I mean? Like they'll never be able to see that boot in any other way as a comrade or, as an ally or support. I think there are, again, rare instances, but systematically, like it just would never the role of an officer will have to just be erased. And we will have to figure out new relationships with people who were impacted by that system, with people who now occupy that space. But you can.
Yeah, sure. No, I mean, I completely agree with everything Mark and Sophia both said. I mean, I do think, I think solidarity in my mind does have a sort of specific meaning that is really about a shared investment in a common struggle that often comes out of sort of, it's a little more of a structural rather than an interpersonal term, at least when we think about labor movement politics, at least. And so, I mean, I don't think anybody would deny that there can be moments of humanity and kindness within unjust systems that corrections officers can, do things that are kind and that mitigate some of the damage. But I fundamentally don't, I don't think the labor movement, there's no space for a solidarity with, a group whose main purpose is oppression, which, is precisely what corrections unions are here for. They're here to enforce racial hierarchies and to protect capital, and not to serve any common good, especially for the working class. And so I think there can only be solidarity with other workers, and solidarity is a complicated thing, right? It doesn't mean equality, and it doesn't necessarily mean liking one another. It means, again, shared struggle, and there is no shared struggle with corrections. I mean, I agree with Mark and Sophia. I mean, this is fundamentally something we want to eradicate. That's what abolition is about, right? So yeah, that would be my answer, I think, to just being a little sort of technical about solidarity, that in a way that forecloses that idea.
That argument about saying that solidarity is structural, not just moments of interpersonal empathy and connection, I think was very, very useful. Tania, do you have thoughts?
I was only going to mention that I've again, I just hear from people that are detained, and so I wish we can have them here in this space and to speak for themselves. But the idea of like them being in solidarity, like people incarcerated and people detained, I agree with Mark. I've seen moments of compassion when the correction officers are not wearing their correction officer's hat. Those are the only moments of like compassion for another human being that I feel there's like a small like human to human contact. But on the everyday 9 to 5 work they don't see these people as human beings. You can't see them as human beings if you're going to do the work that they do and the types of abuses that they do to these individuals. There's no way you can see somebody as even a living being. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. So we have a couple more questions in the chat. We have both Ellen Williams and Sherry Wolf, and I think we have about maybe 13 minutes left. So I think these will be our last questions, because I do want to give the panelists after the questions a chance just to tell us how we can become active, what organizations we can participate in, and also what the struggle looks like at Rutgers. So Ellen.
I know you mentioned Mountain View earlier, and I'm interested because we do have faculty on staff at Rutgers that, are involved as in various correctional facilities in New Jersey. So I'm interested. Who is connected to Mountain View? I think you mentioned, Donna, somebody had some experiences they would share, but I'd like to know a little bit more about Rutgers' involvement in Mountain View and other prisons, because we do have a linkage with that.
Actually, why don't we answer this question, because it's such a specific one. I'll start us off and say that the Mountain View program was started by a historian in my department, Don Roden, an amazing man, Japanese historian. And Mark is actually an alumni of Mountain View. So he can tell us about both the history of Mountain View, how it came to be, and what the experiences was like, and what's happening at Mountain View today.
So, yeah, all right. So there's a couple of things. I'm gonna try to do this brief. So the folks the teachers and faculty members who actually teach inside are not a part of Mountain View. They're a part of NJ STEP, which is the New Jersey Student Transformative Justice Education Program, people who are, impacted in inside, et cetera. So that has been around since about 2015, 2014. I was part of the first cohort of that program as well. And outside, after folks are no longer in carceral positions, they have the opportunity to apply to Rutgers and become a part of the Mountain View community, which was created and started by Don Roden. And I just talked to him not too long ago. He's a pretty chipper old man. That being said, so the faculty members who teach inside they have their more ability to kind of deal with their curriculum and be a part of the students. They or have a training. They have a special training and workshop that they go through before being amongst the students so that they understand that it's a student-teacher relationship, as well as the position and circumstances that their students happen to be under in there. And from the experiences of being on the student side, as an organizer, on the organizer side, facilitating faculty members from in there and from outside, I think that the classrooms in there are like the perfect places for the most innovative and creative and greatest learning experiences. It's very raw and extreme. I don't know how the faculty members themselves take that, because it's such a personal thing that I don't know if they always like kind of would speak on it and have an organization where they're like constantly talking about their experiences there, because it's very intimate and deep, right? And they're not always all politically aligned. However, NJ STEP does provide opportunities for more radical and more folks who are based in educating and getting folks who are in that position to be on more educated learning environments post-carceration are usually a part of that program. I hope that answers some of your questions, and then we can move on, or I can do a little bit more detail if that's like an overview.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mark. I'll just say quickly, so I taught in Mountain View before NJ STEP started. So when I came to Rutgers in 2004, and Don Roden started this program really as a volunteer effort. So he did all the work. He did the work also of getting each of us. I lived in New York and didn't have a car. And so he came and picked me up in, I think, the New Brunswick train station, drove me to Mountain View, and then drove me closer to New York. So he literally did everything. He kept in touch with all the students. He did all the administrative work with faculty and graduate students. And then he also was involved with, in the program, many of the students who were taking classes inside, once they were released, were, I don't know how else to describe, were harassed by their parole officers. And Don played this very important role of making sure that they could get the support that they needed to be able to complete their degrees. So I'd say 10 years before, roughly 10 years before NJ STEP, was a funded effort, it had all been done as a volunteer effort. Which we put in probably 1/1000th the labor that Don Roden put in. He just was amazing. And he did it out of a real sense of commitment. I remember talking to him about it when I first came to Rutgers, and he was talking about how he was moving towards retirement and that he'd lost a lot of family members, and he really wanted to do something important. That's how he saw Mountain View, as the most important thing that he ever worked on. And we are all thankful to him and wishing him the best.
Thank you.
So our final question is from Sherry Wolf.
Hey there, Sherry, I know a number of you. I'm the senior organizer here at the AAUP-AFT, and I have a few ideas of my own about this, but I really want to know what other people here think, because it gets to some of the heart of what I think is the heart of the question for many labor progressives who are reading Miriam Cabo, who are watching presentations like this, who are paying attention to Ruth Wilson Gilmore. There's a mass shift in consciousness as a result of the protests around Black Lives Matter and around the role of the police. That's clearly happening widespread, but certainly among white Americans, certainly among white working class and middle class Americans. But there's a gap that drives the fear of union, even many union, about what that means towards that doesn't necessarily carry over to notions of mass incarceration and the prison industrial complex and the systemic nature that what we're talking about. How do you see taking these openings that have now been kind of created that are much greater than certainly in my conscious lifetime, my adult life, and transferring some of that openness or some of that hearing into this? Because these are different conversations, right? They're related, they're interrelated. But how do you see that happening? Because that seems to drive some of the very deep conservatism, or really not even, just leaving it aside for many of the unions, which is what the national union leaderships, not necessarily all the locals have done, but what the national union leaderships just want to set it aside. They don't want to look at that question. So, because they were worried about alienating some of their members who they fear will not wrap their heads around the questions of mass incarceration and what role it plays. What do you guys think about this?
Thank you so much for that. And I just wanted to make a few framing remarks. So we've got about 7-8 minutes left. So I think that's a perfect way to conclude. And also, if you have suggestions, organizations, petitions, events, let us know. I think many of us in the union are really, this is the kind of politics that makes us get up in the morning. So we also want to hear how we can get involved. And I just wanted to say, building on Sherry's question, this was so clear in the election around defund the police. Watching the violence inside the Democratic Party when we'd had this massive, between 16 and 25 million people out on the street, there's very clear evidence that the protests contributed in important ways to voter turnout. So we have politics on multiple different levels, but there's just no question. But immediately after the election, there was an attack on the idea of defund the police as being responsible for the losses in the down ballot elections. It was counterintuitive, and it speaks to Sherry's point. Like, how do we take the mass mobilization around Black lives and the fury about these such visceral, violent killings that have been documented on video? How do we translate that into sustained rolling back of the carceral state? And what can we do locally?
I think.
You want to get us? Sorry.
Sorry.
Oh no, go ahead, Mark.
I can shoot off something for 30 seconds that I want to kind of say on this point. And one way I think, and this is important, why I think the labor movement needs to address the Amazon workers, right? Because if we know we have a lot of workers like Amazon and other aspects who are taking the bulk of people who are formerly in part impacted by mass incarceration or who deal with issues of mass incarceration, then we immediately bring that entire population demographic into the labor movement and make those issues relevant now, because they are now the relevant voices being heard. So I think that that's like a key issue, and Amazon is one of those spaces where if that is truly addressed by the labor movement and those folks are actually brought into the labor movement, that will be the movement that starts to address mass incarceration, because I guarantee you a lot of those folks will be impacted by it.
Thank you so much for that.
Very quickly as well, I think that at Rutgers, you all have the perfect opportunity to really push Rutgers in a direction that can make a big impact on New Jersey politics. You are it. You are what we have. And Rutgers is a huge university, an important university to New Jersey. And you are the teachers. We have the students working with the students. We have, I bet Mark and ourselves, like, we have access to people detained. If you want them to come inside and speak to them directly, have them talk about their demands and what you all can push for. But I know that the direction that they would want you to go in is to fight in the state of New Jersey. And to really try to shift the momentum there. I know it's a big fight, just understanding what New Jersey politics is like, but you all have a huge opportunity there to really shift the state's politics.
I'll go next so that Sophia can have the last word. I think that'll be more insightful than mine. I'll be short. I mean, I think as a union that's pretty progressive, the Rutgers Faculty Union is committed to principles like the bargaining for the common good framework, in which we want to be involved in the community. We're not just a traditional trade union looking out only for ourselves. I think that's something we can really build on. And so, I was very proud of our union when it passed. I put in the chat here, I hope that opens. We passed a resolution calling for the end of the Hudson County ICE contract. And it passed, if I recall, unanimously on the Executive Council. I felt really good about that. And I think we could do more of that, because that is at the cutting edge of labor politics in New Jersey. And part of the resolution was calling for other unions to do the same. I think we could get a little more hands-on in doing that, doing outreach to other unions. But I also think it's important that we don't just pass resolutions. Words on paper are great, but our union has shown up outside the ICE building in Newark when an undocumented undergraduate student leader was called in to ICE. We sat there and waited for her to come out as a sign of solidarity and to make sure ICE knew we were watching. When the Rutgers police in New Brunswick turned somebody they pulled over to ICE a few years ago, we really pounced on that and denounced it in a strongly worded letter that forced the president of the university to address it. And so, yeah, I mean, I think those are, we could do more of that. I mean, I'm by no means am I suggesting that's sufficient, but it's a good model to build on. I mean, I do think as an activist union, we can help, show how that can be done and work with students and community members as well. And the very final thing I'll say, just in regard to something Tania and Sophia and I are all involved in, the Abolish ICE New York, New Jersey coalition. We do have a weekly phone zap, which I just put in the chat every Friday at noon, an abolitionist phone zap where we call officials in New York and New Jersey making specific demands of them. It's been a really productive event. We've been doing it every Friday for over a year now. And we've occasionally spoken to politicians. We've gotten responses from them that put them on the record. It's a phone zap, and so it's not like the most exciting thing on earth, but it's only an hour. We gather together at noon and we're all on Zoom together. So if anybody is available at noon tomorrow, would love to see you there just to, sort of get more involved and escalate your participation in abolitionist politics. So thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Whit. Might be possible to send that to AAUP Activist tonight, and then everyone who wants to should be getting the email. And Sophia, you can close us out.
Yeah, those phone zaps are really important, and I can expand on that. But I really like this question because it's really true. I feel like people have heard and know, well, I hope they know, and I'm going to tell them that police are like, they started as slave catchers. Like that's the origin story of the police as we know them. And if we view police and understand that history of them as being slave catchers, then what does that make prisons and jails? I mean, it makes them like modern day slavery and modern day plantations. And I think really reckoning with that history and knowing that the police are state enforcers of violence against Black people and otherized people, they exist to put Black people into prisons and jails. And we have to name that, and we have to talk about that in a real way and think about the abolitionist history that we're existing in. Like, where do we even think about the term abolitionist? We think about it from the 1800s and thinking about all of the work that went into abolishing slavery, as it was defined at that time, to now. Like, that's something that always grounds me all the time. And there's so many different ways that when you look at that history, that abolitionists exist. There are people doing the Underground Railroad who were doing that actual work of protecting people as they were escaping slavery, and thinking about it in the modern context of mutual aid, of safety networks, of some of the things that even Whit was describing. I mean, that's one way. They were the attorneys who were fighting and fighting the Fugitive Slave Act at that time. And to me, when I think of the Fugitive Slave Act, it sounds very much like a deportation hearing that I have to litigate at this time. I mean, I think really confronting people with that truth is really important. And in terms of like concrete things people can tap into, phone zaps are super important. I know like Abolish ICE has done a lot to support a lot of my clients in terms of constantly calling ICE officers out and saying, you need to free this person, and focusing solely on the humanity of the person and not the contact with the criminal legal system or all of these things that they try to use to define who's worthy and who's not, but just focusing on the humanity and focusing on that everyone who's within these facilities are part of our communities. And the more that we don't do anything around that, we're contributing. And Survived and Punished is another name I'll throw out there, who do a lot of work of supporting criminalized survivors of sexual violence who are in different facilities and ICE detention facilities. There's a lot of different work that they do nationwide that is really powerful in terms of centering people who are inside and fighting for them based on their humanity and our values. I just think those are some things that people can tap into.
Thank you so much. I think it would be great. We can send out maybe send out an email that lists some of the organizations. I saved the chat just so that we can get to kind of our broader membership, which altogether Rutgers is 100,000 people. It's 50,000 undergraduates, 20,000 grads, 30,000 workers. And of those 30,000 workers, 20,000 are union. But if we have anything to say about that, those percentages are going to change. So I just want to thank all of our amazing speakers. Thank you so much. This was incredible. Such an important topic, and it will not be our last time talking about no more cages in New Jersey. I think that this is an issue that we need to revisit again and again. But yeah, thank you. Thank you for inviting us into your work, your activism, and also having us think some of those questions through about this relationship between the Democratic Party, machine politics, and who the different interests are that support nothing changing, and what some of our tools are through grassroots organizing, consciousness change. And more, I do feel like this fight needs to happen inside the big unions. And of course, it will start at the local level. So just thank you all. And before everyone leaves, I want to say after Freedom School, we have a more informal hangout that's called our after party. So some people bring whiskey, others bring decaf coffee, namely me, but we often just hang out and chat more informally. So everyone is welcome to after party. It just stays on this link. So thank you all. And I think we're having a celebration of our MOA and a discussion of solidarity in our union will be our final Freedom School at the end of the month. So we'll be sending out a note about